All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. We're going to start. This is our Wednesday webinar, and today we've got three great guests with us. First, we've got Rick Braa with AMP Services, Sandip Soli with Real Property Law Group, and Anton from our own association, Washington Hospitality Association. So why don't we just go ahead and get going, because I know we've got a lot of questions coming up, and for folks that are coming in, we'll give you some time to get settled, but if you could ask your questions in the chat or the Q&A, we've got people monitoring that, and we'll relay that to the group here and we can address it. But since last Thursday, we've had a number of announcements directly affecting the hospitality industry that we know that a lot of you are interested in getting more information on. So we'll go ahead and get started. Rick, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your practice, and some of the impacts you believe are affecting your business and the hospitality industry from the governor's latest announcements.
Sure. So our company, AMP Services, provides accounting and financial services for primarily multi-unit restaurant companies. We've got about 200, 250 restaurants, a great density of them in the Seattle area, pretty much from Seattle to Tacoma. So we work with a lot of the wonderful groups in the city, as well as some independent restaurants. The big impacts that we're frankly, I'm fearful of is the major one is the restriction of dining to family members. Restaurants are very social, bars are very social, which have been closed. But the dining of family members makes it very difficult indoors to get any traction, which is a little bit concerning going into the fall. We still have wonderful outdoor dining that we can meet with other friends, limited to 5 tables or 5 people per table. But the impact of the latest kind of rollback for phase 3 to phase 2 is a large concern, and closure of many of the key businesses and providers to our industry has had a significant impact.
Thanks. Sandip, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and the impacts you feel are going to be felt throughout the hospitality industry from the latest announcements.
Sure. I'm an attorney in Seattle representing lots of restaurants, tenants, as well as landlords. And so I see both sides of it. In fact, the Seattle Times quoted me on the impact that, tenants not paying rent on commercial leases will have on landlords who owe, mortgages and payments to banks, and sort of the domino effect this is going to have. Luckily, we were able to work with a lot of our clients in securing those PPP loans everyone's heard about in order to keep the money flow happening. But that's, coming to an end for a lot of our clients. And so now Congress is, considering more stimulus, but I don't see any more PPP loan money coming. So now what's going to happen? And obviously COVID-19 and the impacts and the restrictions are going on longer than we anticipated initially, working with tenants and landlords from, March through now. Before it was sort of like a wait and see, perhaps we can defer rent, perhaps we can have some forgiveness of rent, and now we don't know. And so what is the long-term solution to not being able to operate in full capacity, not be able to generate the revenue that was expected to pay the rents that were required when the rents went up the last several years? And so that is the impact we're seeing. And how do you come up with a fair solution when we don't know when the end is going to happen?
Okay, thank you. Anthony, we all know you, but go ahead and talk about what do you think some of the impacts are going to be with the latest announcements.
Well, Anthony Anton, humble servant of the industry, and proud to be really passionate about everyone that we serve and all the opportunities we've always provided. I'm going to take a little bit different take, and I think that's why this is going to be a good conversation. We need these changes to bring down the numbers, because if we continue to see the rate of increase of the virus that we've seen since around the 4th of July, 2-3 weeks, all we've done is delay a full closure. And so I'm really hoping that even if the actions themselves don't turn the numbers, the statement of what these actions mean and the fear in public to finally get it, that none of us like to wear a mask, but we need to. And a lot of these things seem silly, but I'm really nervous that if the trajectory continues the next 2 weeks, the way they have gone since the 4th of July, the governor's action will be a full, 6 to 2 month closure again, 6 week to 2 month closure. And I absolutely am scared to death about the impact on small dreams, the impact on an industry that I couldn't be more passionate about. That's what's keeping me up at night. And those are the things that I'm fearful of. And some of the actions aren't the ones I would have taken on Thursday, but they were taken by the only one who can make them, and that's the governor. So now let's hope the public starts listening and they start wearing, stop arguing about wearing masks, wear them so we can move in the direction. Yeah, good. And when I say full closure, I mean dine in. Well, it could be stay at home. I'll be honest. It could be another stay at home measure for six weeks to 2 months. I'm afraid of that.
Okay, I've got a question from the group here. One of the attendees, does the 10 p.m. cutoff for alcohol service mean that we need to stop taking orders then, or do we need to pull alcohol beverages like we do at the 2 a.m. last call?
Until we can get better clarification, I would treat it just like a 2 a.m. call. We're working on getting better clarification, but I can have all the opinions I want, but until I get something in writing, I always like to play it safe. And I would play it safe by treating it like what I did at 2 a.m., I now do at 10 p.m.
Right, and I've seen a lot of people come out and say last calls at 9:45, just like they would at 1:45.
And the governor really is trying to get at socializing. I think the explosion of cases we're seeing, I believe around 60% of the cases are now post-high school to 29. And most of those are tying back to a socialized event, whether it's in one of our places in our industry, or whether it's at a party afterwards, or whether it's some large social gathering. Those cases are going there. And a lot of people may say, well, so isn't that the group that's supposed to be safe in recovery? Well, what we're seeing in Arizona and in California is this group gets it and then brings it home. And then that second round of explosion from this group getting it is what fills the hospitals. And so I think what the governor is trying to do is right now get ahead of this. Again, I'm not trying to defend or support his messages, more just articulate the thinking behind it. Is socialization and the need to be a community. I get it. We're an industry of socialization and hospitality, and yet this explosion of cases around the youth between post-high school 29 is all around that. And so how does the governor work to get this back down so we can stay open?
Okay, great. Sandip, one of the things that you'd mentioned earlier was real estate and leases and the impacts that this might have on the leases. Can you go a little bit into that and tell members how they might be able to approach their landlords for potential help?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're experiencing this both on the tenant side and landlord side. So we see both sides of it, which is good because it gives us perspective on, helping our tenants understand where our landlords are coming from and the bills that they need to pay and the cash flow that they need. Obviously, a lot of the tenants and the restaurants don't have the cash flow to be able to do that. So, some of the landlords are asking them to do the impossible and pay basically out of their own pocket or their bank account versus from revenue, which is a hard ask. As I said, the situation's fluid. We don't know when the end is before, and March, April, May, June. The ask from landlords was, okay, well, we understand you don't have revenue. You're operating at much less capacity than was assumed under the lease, and therefore we're going to defer rent. We'll give you some discount now, maybe 50%, but you need to pay the rest at the end of the lease or in another 3 months or at the beginning of the year. Well, that keeps just getting pushed out. Some solutions were to add more time at the end of the term to be able to make up the rent that wasn't paid. Well, again, it's kind of inconsistent with my theme. We don't know when the end is. And who's to say that the restaurants will have the revenue, a year from now, be able to pay back, that rent? I mean, it's not like their business is going to double from their baseline in a year. So some of the solutions we have been seeing from landlords are flexible in terms of charging percentage rent, plus possibly covering the triple nets if that's feasible. And so the percentage net rent structure, which many on this call are probably familiar with, is that it's a percentage of gross revenue, and that could range from anywhere from 5 to 12% that we've seen, depending on sort of the pro forma of what can be done. Obviously, as Anthony mentioned, it's fluid. I mean, if we go back to a situation where it's takeout only, we're not going to have that sort of operating revenue. So, but still at the same time, a percentage rent is flexible. It will go up or down depending on the revenue that is generated. So I think that's a fair solution. And then finally, I will say that there are those that aren't surviving that are asking for lease termination from the landlords. And so we're working with those clients and those tenants in seeing how that can be structured efficiently to create a lease termination and have some sort of resolution. I'll say one more thing. The orders from the governor, King County, City of Seattle, and various other cities are helping. The eviction moratorium is helping to be able to negotiate between landlords and tenants. That has been helpful. The forgiveness of late fees, the late charges, all those sort of things have been helpful to be able to mitigate some of the obligations under the lease.
Sandip, I've talked to a hand. Go ahead, Rick.
I'll piggyback on top of that. So the most important thing that you can do for your landlord is treat them like a partner, not an enemy. So you really have to put some thought to the numbers. They're going to want some forecasts. They're going to want to see what happens. And where you want to start is that get down to an EBITDA number to earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and rent. Or some people call that a NIBO number, NIBO, net income before occupancy. So you want to calculate that out for your landlord so that your landlord can see that you are willing to make an investment in this project as well to keep your business going, that you're willing to even take a loss if need be, or how much of that money you have left over for rent. The second thing is, as Sandip mentioned, percentage rent is the way to go. It's the way that we can scale up and scale down. Having the landlords understand that is critical, and having that EBITDA number to show them is one of the best tools that you can give them, so that they can understand if sales go up, there's some money to share. If sales go down, there isn't. So the last thing around rents, I think that are important to negotiate is, talk to your landlord, like I said, like a friend, not a foe, and find out if they've been able to get forbearance on their mortgage. And if so, how do you share in that? Because a lot of them have. I've negotiated with plenty of banks that have given us forbearance, either interest only for 6 months or interest and principal for 6 months. You can, back to Sandip's point, put this on the end of the lease. That way it doesn't penalize next year. If they're unwilling to go to a percentage rent, you can add a deferral onto the end of the lease. Having them amortize it over next 2021 is really dangerous, because we don't know, as Sandip said, we don't know what it's going to look like next year. And to commit to paying 1.25 times rent or something like that is an error you don't want to make. So we'll put it on the backside, negotiate best case percentage rent. It goes up and down. Be careful of their triple nets. If they're they need to be able to pay their rent. They have building insurance, they have real estate taxes, and they have interest that they're paying. And so making sure that you are aware of the triple net charges as well, because those are the things that come out of their pocket, and using that in your negotiations with your landlord. But it's really meeting with them and trying to keep the restaurant from closing, if that's your desire.
Great thoughts, Rick. I think I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper. Before I do, I just want to get a clarification from Sandip. I've had a handful of conversations with members who are a little confused on the governor's eviction notice. Are they included in that? And what does the governor's announcement on extending the evictions prohibition mean to them?
Yeah, good question, Anthony. That's what we're trying to figure out now. And I've read it, and I've read all the past one. He's simply extending what he's done before through October, and it prevents increases in rent on commercial tenants unless those increases were pre-negotiated prior to February 2020. And so it doesn't do a whole lot right now, but what does do a whole lot, or what the cities are doing, and King County in particular, the mayor of Seattle basically signed an emergency order lockstep with the governor, and probably we're expecting her to do that again in the next few days. That does protect small businesses under 50 employees at a location, such as restaurants. And so that does prevent those small businesses from getting evicted. It does prevent late fees and late charges and interest and all those charges from being imposed upon tenants for not being able to pay rent. And King County has passed a similar ordinance as the city of Seattle did, prohibiting evictions for small businesses under 50 employees at a location through March 2021. We're still studying that to see if that covers incorporated cities versus unincorporated. And the reason that's tricky is because the language in the King County ordinance doesn't exactly say that it only applies to unincorporated King County, but that's usually the general theme of King County ordinances. They don't step over and step on the toes of the cities, but it doesn't expressly say that in the ordinance. So we're trying to figure that out in the legal community, sort of like the theme as other folks have said with respect to the Liquor Control Board. We try to play it safe until there's a court ruling or something in writing. We can't really know whether or not the King County ordinance applies, but I think it's very helpful. And, you know, I'm seeing the city of Auburn do it, the city of Issaquah, and other cities throughout Washington state are implementing eviction moratorium similar to what the governor has done, what the city of Seattle's mayor has done. And so those are very helpful, and to be able to facilitate negotiations and kind of keep the status quo, sort of call a timeout and say, okay, you know, we really need to talk through this systemic problem that we're all facing, so that these spaces don't go empty, these small businesses don't go out of business, and we can figure out what the right solution is going forward, as we just talked about.
So is your read, Sandip, and then I'd love to get back into Rick's conversation for a minute. Is your read, if you're in, I don't know, Sumner, I'll pick my own hometown, the governor's order prevents you from the risk of being evicted until October? Is that your read?
Unfortunately, my read of the governor's order is that it prevents a residential tenant from being evicted through October. As far as a commercial tenant, it prevents rent from being increased unless it was already baked into the lease prior to February. It prevents the rent from being increased, but I don't see anything that prevents an eviction. There are stumbling blocks in being evicted, as you probably heard. The courts are backed up, and to be able to file an eviction proceeding on behalf of the landlord in court is going to take more time than it normally would. The sheriffs are not looking forward to evicting people, whether it's residents or tenants. And so I think there are other things in the system that are going to delay evictions, but unfortunately there's nothing expressly in the governor's order that protects commercial businesses from evictions. But as I said, the count, at least King County and the city of Seattle and others have put in protections in their local ordinances that do protect. I don't know what the city of Sumner has done.
I'm just using that as an example.
I know. Yeah, I know. I'm just saying. I mean,
city by city.
I know. If I could, that's a lot of cities. But I mentioned a few that I've noticed: city of Auburn, city of Issaquah. I've seen, cities are doing things, and so I guess my point is, if the local governments, cities or counties, can add to the governor's order, that would be helpful for tenants.
Is there one, Sandip, that you've seen is really strong, that if people are in their hometowns and they have conversations with their mayors of what we can do to help, you'd say this is a good model?
On behalf of tenants, the King County ordinance is a good model.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, got a
back
question.
to
Oh,
Rick's
go ahead, Ed.
conversation. I think this is one of the most fascinating. If we didn't care so much, if the 3 of us, 4 of us didn't love the industry with everything we have, this would be an incredible social economic experiment. Right now, who knows how many restaurants and hotels are going to go out of business. We're budgeting, because you have to do a budget, 35% of our members will no longer be open. And we don't see people replacing them. Like in a hot economy, you see a restaurant close to and open back up.
Right.
We're predicting a 35% drop for our own budget, not for government, but so we can do our business. We're seeing people get more and more comfortable working from home. And well, wait a minute, I finally figured out how to do it and keep my cat off my computer screen and where my Wi-Fi needs to be so I can work from home. Who's coming in behind us? So I think we're in this thing of we want landlords to be successful. We don't want our banks to fail again. We see what happens there. And there's not a line behind us and we're at risk of closing. Is anyone coming in behind us? And how do we have conversations, to Rick, your point, that say, we're in this together. You got no one coming in behind me, but I need you to stay alive and not go bankrupt and sell off to someone else so I can keep my stuff going. How does that dialogue start?
Could you state a harder question?
Well, sure.
I think.
What's the secret to life?
Yeah. I think it is that, that being honest with the landlord, they're at risk as well. You basically have the mom and pop landlord that, they're living on this money. Then you have the big corporate guys, or people that have, maybe a lot of properties around the United States, and they're dealing with hundreds of tenants that are having a difficult time paying their rent. A lot of those bigger companies are better financed, of course, so they've got a little more leeway, and that's why I continue to go back to the percentage rent model, because it will allow them to pay. If we can cover their trip on that, and even a little bit of percentage rent, they can survive. But if they don't have their triple net covered, then it starts digging a hole for them. But as I mentioned, they can go back to their bank and they can renegotiate as well. But the banks are going to, I'm starting to see an intolerance towards 6 months. Now we're starting to see covenants come into play that say if you want forbearance beyond 6 months, you're going to have to do this, that, and the other thing. And then we're going to have a conversation and we're potentially going to downgrade your loan. So those are the kind of things I think the bigger houses are dealing with that make this more difficult of a situation. But I don't think the banks necessarily have a great interest in seeing the landlords fail. They just want to collect their interest. They'd love to pay down some debt, but we are in a spot now where the indicators aren't pointing too well to, just like any other industry, if the bank wasn't well financed going into this, they're going to go under. And we'll start seeing some of that over the next 6 months, according to some of the banking contacts that I have, is that we're going to see some failures of some regional banks and local banks. But like anything, it creates opportunities for others to come in and scoop them up. So banking's been consolidating for years. So this will further that along and perhaps create a little more dialogue with landlords and with tenants around debt structure. But rent is the most dangerous thing for a restaurant right now because it just keeps going. You can lay all your people off. You can use your PPP to pay utilities, but rent chews it up at a very fast rate, and then you get into your 60-40 split, and you may not get all of your PPP forgiven. And then a lot of banks aren't moving off of the 2-year amortization, and by the time you plug in your forgiveness calculator, you're going to be down to about anywhere from 8 to 12 months to pay that debt. And in some cases, if you have millions of dollars, those are big numbers that you're going to have to pay back. So getting on top of this right now with your landlords is priority number one. And finishing it off, and at least get the next 3 months done. They don't want to talk about 2021 yet. Just get the next 3 months done. Figure out how you can work together to survive the next 3 months. And whether
Sandip, sorry, Rick.
Go ahead.
Sandip, how we use it, you got a foot in both worlds, right? You got tenant clients and landlords. How would you start this conversation? Because it's so overused and seems cliche, but we're in this together, right? If the restaurant goes down, that's going to sit empty for a while. The bank's not going to collect anything. Landlord's not getting anything. How do we start a win-win conversation? Because this is not 2018 when one restaurant closed, 7 more
Right.
were bidding for the lease.
Right.
There's no one coming in behind us.
Right.
Yeah, it's a great way to set up the conversation, as you just did, Anthony. I mean, that is so true. Who is going to come in behind this restaurant? And those are some of the conversations I've had on both sides of the ball, whether representing landlords or representing tenants. I mean, what is the reality if the restaurant tenant goes under or declares bankruptcy? There's really nothing left for the landlord to recover. The space will sit empty for another year, maybe more. We don't know. Again, we don't have a crystal ball as to when things are going to come back and someone's going to be brave enough to open in that space again. So, so the conversation does start with the reality that, even if the lease says that, a lot of landlords are kind of, their initial response is to thump on the drum and say, wait a minute, you've got a lease commitment for the next 5 years. You've got a personal guarantee. All this language in this 50-page lease says you're going to owe this money no matter what happens. You look at I'm sure all of you have been reading about force majeure clauses. Those, most of them don't cover pandemics, right? That wasn't really written in. Or if they do cover things beyond a tenant's control, they say you still have to pay rent no matter what. Quite often they say that. So the landlords they keep pointing to all this lease language that makes that cash flow to the landlord somewhat guaranteed, but that doesn't mean that cash flow is going to happen. If the restaurant tenant goes out of business or goes bankrupt, then that cash flow stops regardless of what the lease says. And so you do need to have that heart-to-heart between the landlord and the tenant to say, listen, we, as Rick said, are partners in this, despite what the lease says. If I go out of business, you're not getting that money, no matter what the language in the lease says. So we need to work together to be able to give you what we can give you from the cash flow that is being generated up or down based on the economy, based on the restrictions. Here's the percentage cash flow we can get to you. And then from there, you can talk to your bank about, well, what's the reasonable cash flow? What kind of forbearance, as Rick mentioned, can you get from the bank? Is it up to 6 months? And then let's wait and see if you can get some more forbearance from the bank. What do you need to cover your triple net expenses, the real estate taxes, the insurance, the common area maintenance, the utilities? What is the minimum that each party needs to be able to survive in this new world? Until things get back to normal. I mean, those are the numbers that people need to crunch to be able to make the cash flow work.
So Anthony, I'm interested in the 35% reduction because we had a churn already, right? Where we'd lose a restaurant somewhere, I believe it was around 27% or so churn rate. And then someone would come and fill that backspace. We can see it at Amazon, the Amazon campus, one concept fails, another one comes in, it's gonna do better and it doesn't. So without that churn and it stops, we'll probably see a substantial decrease in rents, especially anyone that is close to negotiating their next lease. And that's one of the things that I recommend is if you're coming up on a lease negotiation, be aggressive around it. Because there's no one to take that spot. And we're seeing it in the major, Seattle, downtown Seattle area. We're seeing it in major cities like New York, Miami, Washington, D.C., Chicago, all of these cities that have downtown corridors, rents are shrinking. And that does one of two things. Either it's going to push more people out into the suburbs, or it's going to cause those rents in the suburbs to come down. Likely both. So it's also a good time to go back and if you've got 1.5 years left on your lease, to go back and renegotiate that lease for the next 10 years or so. Because if you do have to close the number one thing that you want, if you want to sell your restaurant, you want to have a lease in place. That's a good lease. So someone doesn't have to walk in and absorb a terrible situation or try to deal with it through attorneys and through landlords. They can just simply walk in. They got a beautiful lease to walk into. Gives them a little bit of a runway to get started. We will see a lot of churn, and a lot of the better operators are already looking at what's going to close and what's it going to take for me to get in there and get open. So I think we'll see an expansion of the better local groups that want to take advantage of this, because it's a long-term play. We'll have a year or so of, who knows, a year or so of difficult times, and we'll move on from there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, we are seeing that right now. We are seeing lease negotiations on the one hand dry up for a lot of things that were being negotiated back in January and February. Leases didn't get signed when COVID was coming in, but the discussions were still happening. The rent numbers were coming down. Landlords were getting it, that they weren't going to have a tenant after this one. We are seeing those, as Rick mentioned, that are great operators, great reputations, that are taking advantage of the situation and negotiating leases for prime spots at much lower rents than they would have back in January. So this is an opportunity for good operators to be able to reduce the rent. It's a good opportunity for everybody to be able to renegotiate the rent. And the one sort of legal issue I'd bring up, this is a good time. If you have a long-term plan to sell in 10 years or so, whatever your timeline is to retire or sell, it's a good time to negotiate that assignment clause, because that often is a stumbling block into selling your business. The assignment clause in your lease is the one where the landlord has to consent for you to be able to assign the lease to whoever's buying your business. You want to be able to negotiate that up front, so that's not a veto right for the landlord.
We've got some questions from the audience here. First, I want to read one from Lynette. What practices can establishments implement to create resiliency with the constant fluidity of restrictions and standards? So probably Rick or Anthony.
Wow. Anthony, you want to start with that one?
I'm just going to reread it again. I've never dealt with a situation where my recommendation changes week to week as often as it has because of where it was. I mean, we really thought we had the virus coming down, and we really thought we were in good shape until what we thought the second wave, when the school was going to come back. And normally the flu season starts. And none of us saw this second spike taking off the way it did. And I think being on these calls, being in touch with your area coordinator, and just having a relationship. I think in an industry based on relationships with our guests, I think we need to return to some of the foundations of having relationships with our partners, whether it be our landlord, our association rep, whether it's our bank. Honestly, I think we all need to over communicate. And so I think part of it is there. I would also say, I don't know what's coming next. I mean, we have good recommendations in with the governor's office and other things. We have conversations to try to keep us open. We have ideas for improvement. But early on, people are like, why am I going to buy plexiglass just to take it down in August? Well, now I think that plexiglass is a functional reality through next summer. And I think the best we can hope for is to get everyone to what phase 3 was before last Thursday, meaning get back to 10 guests, get back to the chance for 75%, make the improvements that we need to make in seating. In order to see that, we got to get the spike back down. But once we get that down, I think we're there into next summer. And so I think you really need to look at, can you make that work for your business? And if you can't, this is the time for reality conversations and to come to grips with it. But be flexible. Don't assume, each week check in with your association rep, your bank, and your key partners and your team. And it's old school business, but over communicate.
Yeah, and piggybacking on that, it's absolutely essential if you want to create some kind of constant and resilient environment that you don't give up, that you look at this takeout and delivery are here to stay. They're not going to go away. So you have got to figure out how to make money on those models. That's job one. You've got to figure out how to be break even on a takeout and delivery model. And that means you have to be aggressive with your marketing, pull in everything that you can as far as ideas go, create an outdoor space, secondly, through the summer that is transformative. Don't just throw tables out on the street, and be the best at outdoor dining. But don't give up on the takeout, don't give up on the delivery, and don't give up on maximizing the revenue through the summer through outdoor dining. So those will at least get us through the next couple of months, but you've got to figure out if we're somewhat shut in or limited through the winter, how do you make money, or how do you get to the point where you're close to making money that you can survive to get to March with a takeout and delivery model. And a lot of people say it's not possible, and it is possible, but it's very difficult. And it can't be only just third-party delivery. It has to be takeout, and it has to have value to it, and it has to have a bigger ticket. So it can't be, I'm selling a $5 hamburger for $3.50. It's got to be meal kits and things that actually bump the check average, because your frequency of spend in dining is coming down. So people they're not eating as often in restaurants. So you have to take advantage of those a couple of times a week, at least, of some kind of a program that people love, that want to come and get your food. But this is where the great restaurants are going to separate themselves from the ones that are just surviving. So great restaurants will figure out how to survive through this, get to March, and we perhaps will have a different game that we're playing at that point. Can't count on it, but at least we're going back into that spot, because traditionally what we've done in the restaurant industry in Seattle is, our sales cycle looks like the silhouette of Mount Rainier, really, really heavy in the middle, really skinny on the shoulders. So we take out too much money at the end of the year, we kind of strip out the cash, and then we live on the vendors through February and January and February. We can't do that this year. So cash is king. You've got to plan for lean January and February, and get to March when sales start coming back a little bit and outdoor starts opening up.
Rick, I'm really heartened to hear you say that about to-go dining, because one, you're one of the best restaurant finances minds I've ever met, and it supports a lot of the anecdotes I hear. And I was wondering if the anecdotes have proven to be true. But a lot of people, when this first happened, tried to go for a couple of weeks, used up inventory, then said, "This isn't working for me. I'm losing money." And I get it. We didn't think this was going to go on forever. They stopped doing it. Other people stuck it through, closed it for a little bit to re-tinker, and went back again. And then before we started hitting the phase 2 and 3 conversations, I started hearing people say, "God, it took me 2 months, but I figured it out. And now I'm figuring out how to make money on that." You've worked with so many different operations who probably have a similar story. What are like the 2 or 3 things, if Rick and Anthony and others are saying there's a here, you just got to figure out the right formula. What are the 2 or 3 things you'd recommend that you've seen your clients do to make that start working? Yeah,
so the first goes back to the beginning of the conversation, negotiating that percentage rent, and negotiating a rent that you can live with. The second is be focused on bumping check average. So if you're going to sell drinks, sell $40 worth of drinks, not $8 worth of drinks. If you're going to sell food, sell $50 worth of food, not $20 worth of food. So be focused on check average with your takeout, and really bumping that up and adding value. Don't discount, add value. So add to an experience. For example, if you're a concept that maybe is known for their music and those kinds of things, you can add a little, YouTube link on a little card that people can go out to, and they can listen to a soundtrack while they're eating your food. So enhance that experience rather than say, hey, here's some cold food. Yeah, I know it doesn't travel as well. Think about your packaging, maximize those delivery options, and make sure that you are providing an experience at home, not food at home, an experience at home. People go to restaurants for experiences. They don't go to restaurants, they go to restaurants because they want something different. Number one, they probably can't cook the food, but number two, they want an experience to go along with it. So we have to provide a dine-at-home experience along with it. Not many people are doing that, and it can be done, and it can be done well. But that goes back to not quitting and to finding new avenues into things. So, just a little bit of ice and a little bit of shaker creates a whole different experience along with the soundtrack.
So I've seen the family meals are a great way to do that. I've also some people finally taking advantage of the wine to go, right? If you're at the table, we're incentivizing our servers to sell wine, but when we're to go, we're taking the order, we're hanging up versus, would you like to take Chef Sandip's favorite Washington wine of the week to try with a meal that goes well here, and selling a bottle of wine with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because I'm hearing from folks I miss good wines, and I'm like, well, your restaurants can sell them to you. So anyway, that's not going to work for everyone, but I just think your advice is solid on there. Sorry, Lex, I know you keep saying you have a bunch of questions for us, and we keep enjoying our conversation. So
No, it's great. It's great. We have one question I'd like to get out. This was actually related to the rent discussion. John has, can you please comment on the ordinance passed by the Seattle City Council limiting the personal guarantee liability in commercial rents? So
Sure.
Sandip, that looks like right up your alley.
Yeah, a great question from John Lane of the Washington Hospitality Association. Thank you, John. Something I should have mentioned before. Another ordinance that's helping the negotiations between tenants and landlords. This is an ordinance. I believe it was passed last week or the week prior. Things are so fluid; it's hard to know. Every day there's something new. But the City of Seattle, the City Council passed an ordinance that probably will not be vetoed. I believe it was unanimous or close to unanimous, so it's veto-proof. And the ordinance says that when Mayor Durkin's eviction moratorium expires, currently it's supposed to expire at the end of August 1st. Hopefully it gets extended. But upon that expiration of the emergency order, for 6 months thereafter, a landlord cannot go after a tenant's personal assets to enforce lease obligations for 6 months after the expiration of Mayor Durkin's eviction moratorium. So that pretty much eviscerates, if it's enforceable, that ordinance eviscerates the personal guarantees for at least 6 months following the eviction moratorium. So any rent that's owed from, when COVID started or before through, or pretty much from when COVID started through today for another 6 months, will not be able to be enforced against the personal assets of the tenant or the restaurant owner who signed the lease or a personal guarantee. There are a lot of arguments made in the little community that whether or not that's constitutional or enforceable, I can't apply the court rules, obviously, until we get a written order. It may be challenged, who knows, but at the moment, it does give some leverage for tenants to be able to negotiate kind of the realities of not being able to pay off some of the rent that's owed during the time when they're shut down or severely restricted from generating revenue. So that has been helpful. It just came down last week. I think it'll continue to be helpful in negotiations between landlords and tenants. And we'll see whether or not it's enforceable, at the end of the day, but that case won't happen for probably another 1.5 years.
Thanks. We've got a question from Kristen. Regarding same household for inside dining, what is our responsibility for enforcement? Is our responsibility to just inquire with each guest?
So I guess I'll take this one. And my GA team, if there was anything issued this morning, I've been in meetings, so jump on the chat room and correct me. But as of last night, I hadn't seen a written guidance. So I have a verbal in conversations with the governor's office and others until there's a written. You kind of have two options in the moment. There's not going to be any enforcement if a guest is lying. So don't worry about that. You don't have to, follow them back to their home or have them prove their address. Don't worry about any of those things. You just have to notify them of the requirement and offer to seat them separately. So a couple of different options. One, if you have your host or hostess say, governors require people to be in the same household, will you be sitting at the same table tonight, or are you from different households and you need me to seat you separately? I mean, handle it in a hospitality way, but that would be another option. I think another one that people are preferring was the idea of a poster. It's not everyone when you've got a shill of a staff has a host or hostess right now, and a shell of a staff, not a shill, and put a poster in the front window and say, per the governor's order, he's asking everyone per household to sit at a single table. If your party is in multiple households, we'd be glad to accommodate you at different tables. And the poster would suffice. So hopefully we'll have written writing that as soon as that comes out, I'll get that to you. But in the short term, I think these are two ways to proceed until we can get the written. And Lex, I'm hoping to work with your team on having a poster up on our website, maybe by the weekend or shortly, so we can let people print that out and put it in their window.
The kind of a follow-up question to that, related question. Does the same household restriction apply only to indoor dining?
Yes. So outdoor dining is okay, and hopefully we have a long September and an extension of summer, and that can keep going. But if you want to meet your friend for a cocktail, still can on one of our beautiful decks here in the Northwest. Let's hope for sunshine and the virus to come down, of course.
All right, we're down to our last 14 minutes. And so again, if you have some questions, please put those in the chat or the Q&A. But in closing, I want to give everybody the opportunity to talk about the one thing restaurants really need to focus on, kind of like the Curly character in City Slickers. Pick that one thing, and each one of you will have a different perspective. But Anthony, let's start with you. What's the one thing, if you could only pick one thing that a restaurant needs to focus on to make it through the next, I would say, what, couple months? What would that be?
Usually I've got these answers right off the top of my head, Lex, and you've let me think this one through. If Sandip or Rick, are you ready? Give me a second to organize my brain, and I'll follow.
Sure. Well, why don't I start, since my contribution here is much narrower than Anthony, but he covers everything. Rick covers quite a bit, and so my role here is very narrow. So I think that's an easy one for me. I'm not going to stray outside of my lines, although I've got lots of anecdotes about getting takeout and delivering what I think works, but and also outdoor dining. I've done that too. So beyond anecdotes, from a legal perspective, I think the theme today, and what I'll reiterate, is to be able to get ahead of the situation with your landlord. As Rick mentioned, I mean, your rent is your fixed cost. That's something that currently probably is out of your control. And that's something that you probably need to get control of, because whether or not the revenue goes up and down, whether or not the restrictions get loosened or not loosened or get tighter, your rent is still there in your lease. And that's something that the government's doing the best that they can to put out orders to be able to facilitate negotiations with your landlord. That's something that you need to be proactive about. Some of the landlords maybe not be as responsive as we'd like them to be. Sometimes it's vice versa. But if you can get that conversation with your landlord, talk about how, even if the lease says you're not partners and that you owe rent, reality is the cash flow is not going to happen if you don't start talking and restructuring that rent. Talk about all the details, talk about the numbers that are realistic, as Rick mentioned, based on that EBITDA or post calculation, but and talk about what the landlord needs in terms of being able to pay the landlord's bills, the triple nets, the real estate taxes, the insurance, the utilities, common area expenses. What do they need cash flow from their tenants to be able to not lose the building to the bank? So those conversations need to happen now. I was going to say sooner rather than later, now, and get a hold of that, get that restructured, get that lease amendment signed so you can work through those issues for the next 3, 6 months, 1 year, whatever it takes.
Yeah, and I agree that should be the number one focus. I think the number one focus next to that is to figure out how to build your model around what's new. Nothing's going to change overnight. So you've got to figure out how to build a profitable model with the current situation that you have. Some people have said, my food doesn't work to go, my meals don't work to go on closing. That's fine. But if you are staying open, you've got to figure out how to get to break even or better using just a takeout or delivery model. Outdoor dining is wonderful, and that'll be the profit for the next couple of months. So you should also think about, how do you use your patio 3 seasons a year instead of 1? So building some, temporary structures. I saw one of the questions was, what if I've got a couple of garage doors? Does that suffice? According to what I just read from the governor, you can't have more than, it can't be enclosed by more than 2 walls. So, but figure out how to use your deck 3 seasons, because it's, people want to be out, and we've seen it over and over. People will sit outside if it's 55 degrees, if the sun's even close to coming out. So outdoor dining is a wonderful thing, but you've got to figure out how to make money with takeout and delivery, and think out of the box on how to do that. Create an experience so people want it again.
Thank you. Okay, Anthony.
All right. I think the number one thing I would encourage a lot of operators, we've got to move past the fear and the anger and move to taking care of your business. And I'm still talking to a lot of people who, there's some people who think the virus is a hoax. There's some people who think this is unnecessary. Some people are mad at the president. Some people are mad at the governor. At the end of the day, we can't change that. Those people have the power that they have. There's an election coming up, that'll be different, but you have to make your business work now. And so figuring out, getting back to basics, what's my labor cost? What's my prime costs? What are my other costs? What margin do I need to live to pay my, set aside the commercial for a second. I got my own rents, right? I'm feeding my own kids. This is not a business. This is my job. And in order to do that, you have to make ends meet. And so I think you need to come back to, what do I need to survive? And then how do I make this business work for that? And if the reality is the business model no longer works for you, I would come to that reality quickly, because I think we're going to be here for a while. Don't let the debt pile up. I don't want you to be a statistic of one of those 35, but I also want you to enjoy the rest of your life and have a chance to come back one day. And so don't let this go on too long. I think we're going to be in this through to spring and the summer of next year, face the reality. On the other hand, if you still love this and what you do, and the model isn't working, to Rick's point, what will? I drove by a strip mall the other day, and they worked with their landlord to build. They take up about, 10 parking spots that weren't being used anyway, and they've moved a lot of stuff outside, and I already saw those filling up. May or may not work for you. What's your wine program? I know my wine cooler is empty from February to now. My wife and I have used it. So help me fill it back up. When I call you, say, hey, have you tried this awesome new wine out of the Columbia Valley? It goes great with this. Train the person to answer your phone to be like a server. Whether this is your answer or not, my point is find your answer. To go, hospitality, narrowed labor force, work with, if you're in a small community, maybe you develop your own delivery system if the one available to you isn't cost effective. The point is, let's get on this, let's figure it out. And lastly, secondarily, stay informed. I talked to an operator who heard the governor's speech that bars were closed, but didn't realize that her lounge wasn't included in that. And I feel horrible about that. But I think this is one of those things where, again, your banker, your area coordinator, and your landlord all need to be on speed dial. And you need to be able to say, what do I need to know? And hopefully they can, hopefully that communication stays strong.
Right. Thanks. So we're pretty close to time. Any final words from anybody as we close today's call? Great. Next week we have.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead,
Sandip.
You're about to
the conversation on rent. And Rick and Sandip, I'm on the governor's economic reform or economic recovery task force. And one of the things we're talking about is this tri-dynamic of banks, landlords, and our industry, right? Is there any proposals you've seen around the country that you would encourage the association to use as a model that help balance this? I think if we make any one of those three the enemy, we're gonna have a problem. But if we put the burden on just us, I'm not okay with that. So have you seen anything across the country that is a good model for us to look at, or ways to keep an open mind? I know, Rick, you sat on a subset of that task force for me. Just any thoughts? I stumped you again, sorry.
No, I'll have a thought. I think, we talk about this domino effect, the landlord's counting on the tenants and the restaurants to pay the rent and whatever triple net expenses to pay their bills. The banks are counting on landlords to pay the mortgage, the others. So, what's gonna relieve that pressure? And I think we saw a little bit of that where the federal government provided the PPP loan for the, basically the tenants and some others to be able to pay money up the chain. I think what I've seen a model work on the other end of that cash flow chain is to do kind of, from a government perspective, what Rick intimated, and that is to kind of force forbearance from the banks. So the banks aren't putting pressure on the landlords to, pay as much as required to be paid, and then the landlords aren't putting that pressure down. And so if there can be some relief up above, and we did see that in New York State, Governor Cuomo passed some forbearance or moratoriums on the bank side, and that was, I think, very helpful there in New York. I don't know, how it's all shaken out. Everyone's got their opinions, but if we can release some pressure on at the top, maybe that'll put less pressure going downwards from banks to landlords to tenants.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's exact direction. It really needs to be at the federal government, though. I think a lot of the states are broke and the cities can't do anything. So I think there does need to be kind of a trickle down, transparent trickle down, where the government is relieving the banks and the banks are relieving the landlords are relieving the tenants. That's going to take an awful lot of money and in a long time to get through. But it has to be some kind of a federal push to relieve the banks, and the banks can't be piggish. They have to pass it along. If they are given some additional capital, they need to relieve their tenant, their people that hold their mortgages, and they have to relieve the tenants at the bottom. So it really does have to be that scenario where it does come from a government entity supporting the banks, supporting the landlords, supporting the tenants, but it has to be transparent, where somebody's going to be a pig along the way and take too big of a cut. It's not going to work.
Thank you.
I think that wraps up. We're at hour. So next Wednesday we have Anthony's webinar / podcast that he does once a month. So we've got the registration link up available on hub.wahospitality.org for you to register for that, and that'll be 10 o'clock next Wednesday. So with that, thank you for joining us today, and a replay of this will be available online, and you can find that also at hub.wahospitality.org.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.